What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Thursday, September 19th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. Only a 6-game MLB slate tonight. We had 4 games this morning, so not the biggest slate, but still a decent amount of games. We do have every game starting within basically an hour and a half of the first game, so that's nice. Everything should be wrapping up around the same time. Don't have to wait out any West Coast games starting 3 hours after the slate starts. So that's nice. Should be pretty fun. And no Coors Field on the slate. No teams with massive implied run totals. A couple teams just north of 5, but nothing too crazy. So should be pretty wide open offensively as far as what we can get to. Pitching, there are certainly a couple of guys that stand out in particular that we'll talk about. But looks like a pretty fun tournament slate. I've already kind of glanced at what I'm getting to, and it doesn't feel great. But it is a 6-gamer, so is what it is. Going to go through position by position, stack by stack, all of that, as I usually do, talking about strategy, talking about why I'm getting to what I'm getting to. If you have questions about teams or players that maybe I'm not getting to that you like, feel free to ask. Usually the answer is going to be that they look perfectly fine as long as your lineups make sense and you're taking care of ownership and all of that. Usually it's just going to be a case of I personally happen to not be getting to them, but I think they're fine in the right lineups. But feel free to ask in case there is some reason why I don't like them. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you get an alert when shows go live. But being NFL season, we do have more content on the channel. Nerdy and Brick have been on here doing Battle Royale drafts along with Davis Maddock using Nerdy's sim tool that he's working on during the week. I have my NFL show on Sundays. I've been doing Monday and Thursday shows with Neil Orfield. So we have more stuff during NFL season. Turn on notifications so you find out about those shows. But getting into this slate, starting with the pitching, Yusei Kikuchi showing up the most for me, right around the field at 52%. He has a good matchup against the Angels. The Angels have been better against left-handed pitching this season, but still not a great offense. They are banged up too. When they were doing well against left-handed pitching, I don't know if Mike Trout was healthy, but I know that Luis Rengifo was healthy. He's out. So their active roster right now has a 97 WRC plus against left-handed pitching. They rank 13th in strikeout percentage. Kikuchi is a good strikeout pitcher. He's been good all season long, and the Astros, I think, have made improvements with him as well. 27.5% strikeout percentage, 3.25 xFIP for Kikuchi this year. He has been somewhat home run prone, allowing 1.25 home runs per 9 innings. But again, this is an Angels team that doesn't have a ton of good hitters. You're in Houston, which is a park downgrade compared to Angel Stadium. Kikuchi just looks really, really good here. I am pretty much in line with the field. At 52% ownership, it's not a spot where I think I really need to go crazy and play a whole lot more of him. But I do think the ownership is pretty much correct. He looks like the best pitching play to me on this slate. It's not particularly close. He looks like the best pitching play for the field, and I agree. Beyond that, we have a handful of other pitchers getting 20 to 40% ownership, both for the field and for me. So we can see here that I'm not really doing a whole lot different than the field when it comes to pitching, like really close to the field with my exposures compared to pitching exposures. And I do think that that's fine because I have already kind of glanced at what I'm getting to offensively. And so as a reminder, everything here does go hand in hand. The more popular offenses that you're playing, the more you should most likely be considering using contrarian pitching. The more you're playing contrarian offenses, the more you can get away with using popular pitching. The idea basically is, obviously on a lineup level, you want your lineup to have some realistic, reasonable path to winning a tournament without simply having to outrun, half of the field that's playing the same thing as you. But once you already have that within a lineup, you just want upside and high projection around it. You don't usually want to be putting yourself in a position, at least on a normal size slate, where if you hit on some low probability stack or some low probability pitcher, that then you also need to hit on another low probability thing for that lineup to be any good. The larger the field and the fewer games there are, the less that is true. There are obviously exceptions to that rule, but generally, that's why you'll see exposures for me or any player you look at. Everything is related. So the more that you're concentrated at pitching, the more spread out you're probably going to be offensively. The more you're playing chalk pitching, the more you're probably going to play contrarian bats and all of that. So usually if you see my pitching exposures this spread out and close to the field, there's a pretty good chance that I'm taking a stand somewhere offensively. But you talked about Kikuchi. Brian Bayo showing up 36% for me. Fields at 27%. Good strikeout matchup. Park upgrade for him as well. Pretty solid pitcher. Not a great strikeout pitcher, but 21.5% K percentage this year, 3.91 xFIP. Good strikeout matchup against the Rays in a good park for pitching. Tampa Bay's active roster ranks fourth in K percentage against right-handed pitching at about 26%. They have a 92 WRC plus. Very happy to get the Bayo here. Eric Fetty, 24% for me, 20 for the field. 7,600 in a good spot against Pittsburgh. Fetty is a pitcher that, just has been solid overall this season. Going back to his time with the White Sox, 20.8% strikeout percentage, 4.23 xFIP. Made some improvements when he was overseas in, I believe, Korea. Came back and has been a solid major league pitcher. Gets to face the Pirates, who rank 11th in strikeout percentage and have a 96 WRC plus against right-handed pitching. Brandon Pfaadt, Javier Assad, Luis Severino, all showing up 20 to 25% for me, 19 to 23% for the field. Not the best matchup for Pfaadt in Milwaukee going up against the Brewers, but he is a solid enough pitcher. The Brewers do have a relatively low implied run total here. They are still running out a pretty normal lineup. They ended up playing a pretty normal lineup yesterday. They're doing it again today. Contreras is still in there, Turang leading off, Torrio hitting second. The middle of the order isn't the best. You have Garrett Mitchell, Parkins, Jake Bowers, 4 through 6. So no Hoskins, but you do have Bowers in there in his place. No Willie Adames today. That's the big name that is missing. Obviously no Yelich either, but that's injury related and has been a while. So overall, an okay spot here for Pfaadt. He is reasonably priced at 8,700. He comes into the game with about a 23% strikeout percentage, 3.74 xFIP, highly regarded pitching prospect that has been putting it together and just looks pretty good here. Javier Assad, not a great strikeout pitcher and not a great strikeout matchup against Washington, but he's only $6,300. So he's going to look like a pretty good value play when you do need to pay down for pitching. Washington is bottom 5 in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching on their active roster. They do also have a 95 WRC plus. There is young talent in this lineup, but still, on a day-to-day basis, not an above-average offense at this point. Assad comes in with a 19.5% K percentage, 4.64 xFIP, 10% walk percentage is certainly higher than you would like, but it all just comes back to him being $6,300. Severino, tough matchup against the Phillies. The game is at least in New York, which is better than it being in Philadelphia. But at 9K on a lot of slates, I wouldn't really have much interest in Severino here. On a 6-gamer, he's just going to show up a little bit because he does still obviously have a reasonable range of outcomes for his salary. He is in a park that is pretty fair for pitching. So, don't love him. Don't love the matchup. 21% strikeout percentage, 4.18 xFIP. Very, very similar as far as talent goes to most of the other pitchers on this slate. Zach Little showing up 16% for me, 15 for the field. Good strikeout matchup against the Red Sox, and it is a park downgrade for Boston's offense. They rank 10th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. They do also have a 117 WRC plus, which ranks 4th. It is far from a safe matchup for Little, but he is relatively inexpensive at 7,400. He has about a 21% strikeout percentage, nearly identical to Severino and to Eric Fetty. 4.12 xFIP is very comparable to those guys as well. So that's another reason that you are seeing the flat exposures for me, is that when you factor in matchup and talent, like these guys are kind of all the same. And so pitching today actually sort of, it's kind of similar to how offenses look on a lot of slates, and a lot of slates recently in particular, where I've been talking about that I'm very spread out across offenses because they all have very similar ranges of outcomes. And I don't particularly want to just randomly grab 2 or 3 teams and say, oh, these are my 2 or 3 teams today, when I think that they're basically the same as everything else. That's kind of how pitching looks today too. Kikuchi separates from the group, but he's also very expensive at 9,900. But then you look at the projections over here, and it's just a bunch of guys between like 14 and 16 DraftKings points, which from a range of outcome standpoint is not a big difference at all. So not that it's wrong, but my approach typically in a spot like this isn't going to be, especially when there's not ownership inefficiencies, all the ownership is pretty much spread out the way that I think it should be. My approach isn't going to be to just say, all right, well, I'm going to grab Fetty and Pfaadt, and I'm not going to play Assad, Severino, or Little, and hopefully I'm right. Like, that's usually not going to be my approach. That would change if the projected ownership, instead of being the way that it is, let's say it was like 40% to Bayo and 35 to Pfaadt, and so you had Severino at 10, and you had Assad at 10, and Fetty at like 15. If that were the case, then I would be giving up some Bayo and some Pfaadt, or whoever I said was popular, and playing more of Fetty, Assad, Severino, because I think that they are under-owned, and I can take advantage of that, exploit the field by going that route. But because the ownership is projected to be flat, across a group of guys who I think also has a very flat range of outcomes, very comparable range of outcomes, I'm going to end up approaching it this way. Ideally, I think that's how I should approach it. That's what my process is showing. And so I'm happy to see that. So that's why I'm spread out here with the pitching. Patrick Corbin getting 4% ownership. I'm getting to 8%. He's obviously not very good. He's 6,900. So he's cheap. I think he probably is most useful in a lineup where you do need to pay down for pitching, but maybe you have a relatively popular offense, so you don't want to go to a 23% owned Javier Assad. He's obviously better than Corbin. He projects better, but Corbin is still not a huge underdog against him. 13.5-point projection for Assad, 10 to 11 points for Corbin. So Assad is the favorite, but it's not by like a massive margin. You can use Corbin to differentiate, but certainly not somebody that I want a lot of my night revolving around. Moving over to the stacks, and this is what I was alluding to before, the Angels are showing up a lot for me. They have the lowest implied run total on the board. This is sort of what happens on 6-game slates, especially when you have one pitcher pulling 50+% ownership. So I am getting to Kikuchi. I think he's the best pitching play on the slate. This is not a situation where I'm looking at this and saying, oh, wow, the field is crazy. They think you say Kikuchi is good here. I think he's bad or anything like that. It's just in lineups where I don't have Kikuchi, the easiest way for me to win a tournament is to just have the Angels. And so that's why I am getting to a lot of Angels here. So it's a negative correlation play against Kikuchi. It is also an affordable Angels team. So they don't necessarily have to be the highest scoring team on the slate. If they just are in the mix, there's a good chance that the players I'm going to be able to put around them end up getting, they have enough upside to get me there, even if the Angels are like, the third best scoring team instead of first, because they are affordable. You look at their lineup today, Taylor Ward leading off, Zach Neto hitting second. Neither of these guys are bad hitters. They are north of 4K. Other than that, everybody's below $4,000 on DraftKings. You have Brandon Drury hitting cleanup at 2,800. Not a great hitter, but still batting cleanup. Logan O'Hoppe, a catcher, 3,600, batting fifth. So it's a situation where you can build very high upside lineups if you assume the Angels do well, which obviously you may as well do if you have them in a stack. So that's why I'm getting to them. The Cubs are very obviously in a good spot against Patrick Corbin. They are one of the teams on this slate with an implied run total north of 5. They look good. Pretty much goes without saying. I think everybody's pretty well aware of that. 194 expected ISO to right-handed hitters for Patrick Corbin this season. 17.5% strikeout percentage. So I've said this before, but I don't think Corbin is as bad as people make it out to be. I think there's a tendency to act like he's the worst pitcher in Major League Baseball, and I don't think that he is. I think that's because, for one, it's kind of just a fun bit, but then also he's getting paid like a top 10 or 15 or whatever pitcher, and relative to salary, he might be the worst pitcher in baseball. But I do kind of always feel the need to reinforce that when he is pitching, because he's bad, and I do want hitters against him, but he is a major league pitcher. This isn't one of those guys that you look at him and you're like, why is this guy in the major leagues? He should be at AAA or something. Like, he's a below average major league pitcher. Milwaukee, I'm getting to a bit here, and I think that makes sense as well. Brandon Pfaadt getting some ownership. Milwaukee does have talent in their lineup, and they are affordably priced today. Not having Adames in there weakens the lineup, but it does also make that stack cheaper. Bryce Turang, Chorio, Contreras, all between 4 and 5K on DraftKings, 1 through 3. Every other hitter is $3,100 or less. Garrett Mitchell batting cleanup at 3,100. Perkins hitting fifth at 2,800. Bowers is 3K. Ortiz is 2,900. So this is a situation, like I was saying with the Angels, where if the Brewers do well, you should have whatever players you want around them for the most part. And this is a good park for hitting. This is a talented offense, even if it's a little bit weaker than usual. So I think that makes sense. And then you also get the negative correlation against Brandon Pfaadt. This is a team where, they have an implied run total around 4. They're not particularly likely to succeed. Their median projections aren't that high. But because of their talent level, their ability to steal bases, their ability to hit home runs, especially in this park, when they do well, when they have that game, they score 6 or 7 runs, it's likely to be very useful for fantasy purposes because they do have power and speed. They're not a team where if they happen to luck into 6 or 7 runs, they probably just hit a bunch of seeing eye ground balls all stacked together and got a bunch of singles. So the range of outcomes for a team like Milwaukee, even when their implied run total is a little bit lower, is still pretty favorable as long as you can get them at modest ownership and or cheap prices, which I think is the case today. Washington, another team that I'm pretty happy to get to here. They are facing a 20 to 25% owned Javier Assad. And like I said when I was talking about pitching, I think Assad's a perfectly good value play. I would obviously rather play him when I'm paying down than Patrick Corbin if ownership's not an issue. But it's not like he's a great pitcher. He's got like a 4.5 xFIP. He gives up over 1 home runs per 9 innings. He walks guys, gets behind in counts. And Washington does have talent on their roster, in their lineup. So you are getting leverage against a pitcher that mostly is popular just because there's 6 games on the slate and he's cheap. He's not actually popular because he's a really good pitcher. He's not terrible, but it's not like you're just stacking against an ace or anything like that. So I do think Washington makes sense. For some reason, their lineup is not showing up in front of me, but I'm assuming that we don't have it yet either. But assuming it's going to be your normal-ish lineup. They do have talent in there with Cruz and Wood and Abrams, amongst others. So we did get it. Abrams leading off, Cruz hitting second, Wood hitting third. So those are the guys that obviously you want to get to. They are expensive, but then the rest of the lineup is cheap. So that does help to balance that out. Use 2 or 3 of those main 3 guys. And then you have Chaparro hitting cleanup at 3K. You have Tena hitting 5th at 3,300. Ruiz a catcher at 3,700. Yepez is cheap. Darren Baker hitting 8th minimum salary. Jacob Young has speed in the 9-hole. So he's not, a completely useless 9-hitter or anything like that. So I do like the Nats here, especially with the negative correlation with Javier Assad. And then just, more spread out across Arizona, Houston, Tampa Bay, Philadelphia, Boston, all these teams, showing up. But getting to the Angels a lot, getting to the Cubs a lot. I like Milwaukee. I like Washington. With Arizona, you have a talented offense in Milwaukee, so it is a park upgrade for power there. You have Tobias Myers on the mound for Milwaukee, 162 expected ISO to lefties this year, 184 to righties. He's not a bad pitcher at all. Somebody in chat, I missed too. Einsteinium asked if there was a significant difference between Myers and Severino. I don't really think so, at least in my head. I can double check the projection, but they should be pretty similar. Tobias Myers, 13 DraftKings points for me. Severino, 15. Myers getting half the ownership. I think Myers is perfectly fine as a tournament pivot. It's not a good matchup against Arizona. It's also not a good matchup against Philadelphia. Arizona is a difficult team to strike out. They rank 5th so it is a worse matchup against Arizona than Philly. Philly obviously has dangerous hitters, but Arizona is 5th in WRC plus against right-handed pitching this season on their active roster. They rank 6th from the bottom in strikeout percentage. Philadelphia, middle of the pack in both of those numbers. So I do like the matchup a little bit better for Sevy, and that's why you see that in the projection. But as far as range of outcomes goes, if I think you can kind of use Tobias Myers versus Severino the same way that I mentioned Corbin versus Assad, where I prefer Severino, but in a lineup where maybe I'm playing like a popular Houston team and I have a Cubs batter 2 in there or something, play Myers instead of Severino, offset some ownership that way. I do think that's perfectly fine. The matchup does suck from both a strikeout and production standpoint, but Myers not a horrible pitcher. Arizona, though, does look like a pretty good stack to me just because they are getting that park upgrade for power. They do have a very good lineup. Started out the year slowly, but turned it around as you would expect. Ketel Marte is back in the lineup. Corbin Carroll's in there. Peterson, Walker, 1 through 4, pretty expensive. You do have Pavin Smith hitting 5th. He's 3K, so you get some salary relief there. Gabby Moreno hitting 8th, $2,900 catcher. Perfectly fine piece of a stack to save some salary there also. Checking the Milwaukee bullpen because I do want Arizona does have a lot of lefties that you'd be going to. The Brewers bullpen currently has 3 left-handed pitchers. They all should be available today. So there is potential pinch hit risk, or at the very least, just less than advantageous matchup risk for the left-handed bats in this lineup. Pavin Smith, Jake McCarthy, Pavin Smith probably in particular, the guy that I'd be most concerned about getting pinch hit for. But I'm not as concerned about pinch hit risk, just as mentioning, if this game is competitive, when you get to the middle innings, the Brewers can match up with these lefties. But overall, still a fine spot for Arizona. Houston going to be, I assume, one of the more popular teams. High implied run total going up against the Angels in Houston. Highest implied run total on the slate. So I do assume they'll be pretty popular. Jose Suarez making the start. Probably not going super deep into this game. He has been working out of the bullpen. This season, not a huge sample in the major leagues. 184 expected ISO to right-handed hitters. You go back to last year, 216 expected ISO to right-handed hitters, 106 to lefties. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't want to play Yordan Alvarez. He is really, really good. Same goes obviously for Kyle Tucker. But Alex Bregman, Yainer Diaz, Jeremy Pena, very favorable matchup for these guys. I would expect them to be popular, and that's really the only negative with Houston. Going to go through position by position, but first, a reminder to sign up using the links in the description below for Endgame Syndicate and or my NFL content. Endgame Syndicate is the site that I started with Utical, Brick75, and Nerdy Tenor. The goal there is to make you better at DFS, help you out in a sustainable way so you can improve your process. You can find ways to beat what is a very difficult game at this point. We all approach it differently. We all have had success in different ways. And so kind of whatever your background is, whatever your skill set is, there's somebody that probably should be able to resonate with you, help you out, answer questions that you have, bounce ideas off of, all of that kind of stuff. It's something that I wish it existed when I was learning DFS, getting better at DFS, trying to make that jump from, an average player to an above average player, which hopefully I am now. I would like to think so, but even if you don't think I am, probably think at least one of those other guys are. So, would have saved me a lot of time, saved me a lot of effort, saved me a lot of losing money by trying out shitty ideas when somebody could have just told me why they were shitty. So excited about that. All of my content is there as well. It is actually on the site now, so you don't even have to get it through Discord. There is a content section on the site for subscribers to get my NFL stuff, baseball stuff, all of that. If the price point doesn't make sense for you because of the DFS volume that you play or whatever the reason may be, you can get access to just my content using the content link in the description as well. For NFL showdowns, I have my projections, optimal percentages, how often different players show up when each captain is optimal, all of that stuff. For main slates, I have a game-by-game written article along with everything I just mentioned for showdown. I'm doing that for baseball too, but obviously that season is wrapping up. So check those out if you're interested. Definitely recommend either one of them. So moving over to catcher now. Yainer Diaz is going to get a bunch of ownership. As you can see, 18%. Projected ownership, I'm at about 10%. But William Contreras, I'm 2x the field there, and I like it. It's not a good matchup against Brandon Pfaadt, but this is one of the best hitting catchers in baseball. It's a 6-game slate, and you're only getting about 10% ownership coming into him. Only a 140 expected ISO with about a 28% K percentage against right-handed hitters for Brandon Pfaadt this year. So it's certainly not a spot where I'm looking at this matchup and thinking that William Contreras has an advantage or anything like that. It's more so just saying William Contreras is really good and has as much or more home run upside than any catcher pretty much anytime he plays. So when he does well, it is likely to result in a lot of fantasy points, as opposed to a lot of catchers when even if they have a quote unquote good game, it's like 12 because they get a couple hits, score a couple runs. So it's basically just embracing the volatility that William Contreras brings because of his ability as a hitter. Logan O'Hoppe already showed that I'm stacking the Angels a lot. It makes a lot of sense if I'm going to be stacking the Angels to be getting to Logan O'Hoppe. He's affordable. It's a weak catcher position where ideally I can take advantage of correlation and use a catcher where there's less opportunity cost from my stack. O'Hoppe also just happens to be one of the better hitters on the Angels. He bats fifth, so I think he's fine as a one-off, honestly. But certainly in Angel stacks, I'd be wanting to get to him, especially at 3% ownership. I will say there is a chance the Angels just end up being more popular too. We've seen this a lot this season, I think as a result of Sims tools bumping up teams that are facing the most popular pitchers. Pretty good chance, and I will end up adjusting this before lock, but a pretty good chance the Angels end up being 6-7% owned instead of 3. So still will look like good plays, but I will end up coming down a little bit on them, most likely. Keibert Ruiz, I do like him at 5 to 6%. Same kind of thing. $3,700 price tag is very fair. He's got a pretty decent matchup against Javier Assad. He's batting sixth. I think he's a good contrarian play. I think he's fine by himself. Definitely would want him in Washington stacks also because that's just going to allow me to get better one-offs in those stacks by utilizing a catcher. Real Muto, basically the same thing as Contreras, except in probably a little bit better matchup against Severino. I don't think he's as good as Brandon Pfaadt, but it's the same kind of thing. You're just getting low ownership on one of the better, most talented catchers on the slate and hoping that he happens to do something. Yainer Diaz, from a matchup standpoint, is obviously the guy that you want to get to. I have 10% at catcher, may have a bit more at first base, but would certainly prefer to be rostering him at catcher if I can. One thing from the Astros to keep in mind is that in a lot of your Astro stacks, you may actually prefer using Diaz at first base because Victor Caratini is batting sixth as a $2,300 catcher. So you could actually punt catcher with Caratini at $2,300, play Diaz at first base, and finish up your Astro stack that way. So this is a case where even though as a one-off, I would rather be playing Diaz at catcher, but if I'm including him in Astro stacks, he does actually make some sense at first base as well. You do have John Singleton at first base, so you can only roster 2 of Diaz, Caratini, Singleton, but yeah, it makes sense. If you're playing Caratini, you would just play Diaz at first base, obviously. Danny Jansen, right around the field on him, going up against Zach Littell, 10% ownership, or 11% ownership for Jansen, 10% for me. So no real stand there. And then just kind of getting a little bit over the field on Ben Wortnott, even with the field on Gabby Moreno, way under the field on Caratini. So this one's interesting to me. He's actually getting a little bit more ownership than Diaz. And it makes sense because he's 2,300. You also can roster him at first base. So obviously, doesn't matter which one you roster at first or at catcher if you're playing them both. But if you're playing them individually, you probably want them at catcher if you can make that work. Caratini is just an interesting one where he's getting a lot of ownership because he's very cheap and he's on the team with the highest implied run total. So point per dollar wise, he does project very well, but it is the type of play that I generally am willing to get away from because I'm not all that concerned about Victor Caratini putting up a score that I can't just match somewhere else. He has been above average offensively overall this year, 114 WRC plus. He projects to be average to a little bit above average going forward, but still not a big time power hitter, not a stolen base threat. 133 ISO this year, projects in that range. 122 career ISO. Hasn't stolen a base this year, has 4 career stolen bases. So could he hit a home run? Could he do some damage here against Suarez? Sure. But when it comes to popular plays, like I'm a lot more scared to not be getting to Yanner Diaz than to not get to Caratini because Diaz is the one that's just more likely to give you a good actual raw score as opposed to Caratini, who's more likely to give you a good point per dollar score. But because of the way that baseball scoring works, that a lot of times isn't going to end up being that important. So that's why I am getting to Diaz a bit more than Caratini, even though Caratini is the better value. At first base, Christian Walker, 16% for me, 8% for the field. I like that. Happy about that. Again, just a talent thing here. If the field is just by and large going to go to the Cubs and the Astros like I expect them to, I will gladly play really good hitters from other teams like Christian Walker, even if it's not a perfect matchup against Tobias Myers. I did mention, I'm double checking it now, but Myers this year has given up a little bit more power to righties, 184 expected ISO to righties compared to 162 to lefties. His strikeout percentage is much higher against righties, 26% to 18%. So I don't think it's a great matchup for Walker or anything, but I did want to mention that he has been a little bit reverse splits as far as power allowed. Joey Gallo is not in the Washington lineup, I don't think. Yeah, Joey Gallo not in the lineup, so we can ignore him. It probably just becomes somebody else from the Nats. The idea of the play was just going to be that I'm getting to the Nats and he's cheap and he's in that lineup, but obviously not going to be getting to Gallo. Patrick Wisdom, about half the field at first base, probably have a bit more at third base. He is a bit different than somebody like Caratini because he actually does have legitimate power. He is very cheap. I doubt that I'm really over the field on him. I don't know yet how much I have at third base. He is getting 22% ownership, which is a lot for any hitter. But this is somebody where if I don't have him, I am actually going to be nervous about it because it is a good matchup against Wisdom or against Corbin, and Wisdom does have legitimate power to make you really regret not playing him. Nolan Schanuel, over the field on him. If you're stacking the Angels, yes, it's lefty-lefty, but he's batting third. He's one of their most talented hitters. May as well be getting to him if you are going to the Angels. Chaparro getting to 10%. Probably have a little bit more once I rerun stuff with Gallo out because this 12% from Gallo has to go somewhere. But batting cleanup at 3K, not getting much ownership against a pitcher in Assad, who is pretty average. I think he makes sense, especially with Assad getting some ownership as well. Batting cleanup, good price, all of that. Trying to pull up his minor league stacks, but they won't load. Bryce Harper, same kind of thing as Christian Walker, right around the field on him at 10%. Don't love the matchup against Severino. Don't love the park, but they're both perfectly fine. And Harper is clearly really, really, really good. Brandon Lau, a little below the field at first base. Probably have a little bit more at second. He's somebody that typically I'm going to want to play more at second base just because the opportunity cost is typically going to be lower. As far as guys the field is getting to that I'm not, other than talking about Wisdom, I don't have any Caratini at first base. So it does, at least right now, look like a pretty strong fade on Victor Caratini. And again, I think he's a good point per dollar play. If you were playing cash games, I assume he is your cash catcher at 2,300. But it's just when you look at the guys that are going to get ownership on this slate, if I click back to all hitters and we just look at who's getting the most ownership, Swanson, Wisdom, Alvarez, Caratini, Diaz, Suzuki, like Caratini just stands out as far as who are you least afraid of out of those top 6 owned guys. Who are you least afraid of, hitting 2 home runs or hitting a home run in a double and getting a stolen base or whatever it may be, that puts up a score that you actually can't find anywhere else. Not to say Caratini never hits home runs, but clearly he's the one that I'm least afraid of not getting to. And just, I can find, other cheap players. I understand that he's a really good point per dollar play. I understand his price is different than most of these guys, but you can still make it work pretty easily just not using him. So he's the one that I am getting to less than the rest of these guys. You can see I'm actually over the field on Wisdom overall, a little under on Swanson, a little under on Alvarez and Diaz, over on Suzuki, but most under on Caratini. And that's really exactly how I would want it to be from a theoretical standpoint. Like, that's the first guy that I look to get away from, or want to look to get away from on a slate, is the most popular guy that isn't volatile, that doesn't have a big standard deviation, doesn't have a hugely wide range of outcomes. And in this case, that is Caratini. In NFL, it's typically going to be like your running back that doesn't catch passes and maybe doesn't even get all the goal line work, for example. But in baseball, a lot of times it's going to be your cheap guy that is on a popular offense and is just showing up in lineups for that reason. At second base, getting to Bryce Turang a good amount, leading off, going up against Fod. Again, if you're going to go to the Brewers, get some negative correlation on Fod, Turang makes a lot of sense. Also, if I remember correctly, Fod is not particularly good at holding runners. Trying to find that spreadsheet right now. He either is good or is not good. It's one or the other, I think. Yeah, he's been below average at holding runners, at least based on the data I have. I know somebody pointed out the other day that somebody was wrong, but Lance Lynn had been a lot worse this year or something. But Brandon Fod hasn't been good at it. Bryce Turang will run a bit. So happy to get there. Arcatelza said Adam asking for Caratini to homer today. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he's at 3 home runs at this point. It's probably just going to be first 3 at bats too. No doubter. It's just buries me. But yeah, I've cringed every time I've said it. But yeah, hopefully that doesn't end up happening. Drop Rosa said nice call yesterday on Yastrzemski. He cashed home run his first at bat. Yeah, I really need to start betting those because I never remember to come into the show with a home run pick. And then you guys ask at the end, and I just grab somebody random. I know I did it with Wallner the other day too. And I should probably just start betting those, or at least playing a lot of the guy or something, because they have been coming through at a ridiculously high rate. Jonathan Aranda at second base, 2,700 batting cleanup, 7% owned. Perfect example of what I was just talking about with Caratini. Jonathan Aranda's range of outcomes is absolutely not different than Victor Caratini's. Caratini's going to project better because he's on a team likely to score more runs in a better matchup. But I can just get less than half the ownership on the cleanup hitter for the Rays instead of the 6 hitter for Houston. Perfectly fine way to save some ownership while still getting salary relief in my lineup at a relatively weak position where the opportunity cost isn't high, just like it isn't a catcher. You could actually probably argue that the opportunity cost of catcher today is higher than second base. At catcher, from a talent standpoint at least, you have Contreras, Real Muto, Diaz, probably other guys, Ruiz, guys that I probably am forgetting. Second base, you kind of don't have a lot. You have Marte, Lau. Yeah, I mean, these guys are all fine, but I wouldn't even necessarily say that I prefer second basemen to catchers today. So that's another point to just finding cheap guys here, which is what I appear to be doing. Brandon Drury showing up 10% of the time as well. Nico Horner batting 7th. I like him. I'm right around the field, but he's a nice piece in Cub stacks because he's not getting as much ownership as some of the other guys like Suzuki, Patrick Wisdom. So, if you play Horner in place of one of those guys, you get a relatively contrarian Cub stack. If you play him alongside them, you're still lowering your ownership at least a little bit, even though he's obviously going to be heavily utilized in lineups that have Wisdom and Suzuki. So from a combination standpoint, it's not going to be a contrarian play, but just from a raw ownership standpoint, it's still relatively low owned. So I do like getting to him a bit. Patrick Corbin also, if I remember right, is bad at holding runners. Yeah, Patrick Corbin extremely bad at holding runners, worst on the slate. So that also works in Nico Horner's favor. He will run. So I like that. Luis Garcia, if you're going to the Nats, makes sense, except for the part where I don't think he's in the lineup, so I take that back. Yeah, he's not in the lineup. Darren Baker is at second base, hitting 8th at 2K flat. So if you're going there for salary relief, fine. But Garcia definitely would have been a better second base play from a DFS standpoint. So kind of sucks that he's not in there. Jack Lopez, 2K guy, hitting 9th. I honestly have no idea who he is. He's in these lineups just because he's on a team that I'm stacking and he's 2K, the weak position. If you're not stacking the Angels, I wouldn't want Jack Lopez, I assume. unless I'm about to pull him up and find out that this random 9-hitter on the Angels is actually really good. But yeah, he's 31 years old, about to be 32. He has played 24 major league games. He projects for an ISO around 100. He stole 15 bases at AAA this year, so he has that working for him. But realistically, I would assume that he is only, or I would hope he is only in Angel stacks. Yeah, four out of 50 Jack Lopez lineups, all 4 of them Angel stacks. And pretty safely ignore that guy, I think, if you're not playing a bunch of Angel stacks. And he certainly wouldn't be in my first Angel stack anyway. Bryson Stott, again, just kind of a talent play going up against Myers over the field there. Under the field on Donovan, at least at second base. Might have a little bit more in the outfield going up against Luis Ortiz. He's just not the scariest guy to fade. He did have a big game yesterday. I think he homered, doubled something, had like 20 fantasy points. But yeah, he's a good value. He's somebody that if you're stacking the Cardinals, by all means, get to him. As far as one-offs go, I'd rather get some lower-owned guys if I can. Ketel Marte, 9% ownership. I have 6%. The salary is a problem at 5,800, but also the salary is a problem because this is a position where you can see that from a roster construction standpoint, I'm paying down a lot. So like if I pay up for Marte, it's nice because he is a really good hitter. He's low-owned, all of that. But then I have to figure out where else to pay down. The nice thing, though, is the lack of ownership. So like, for example, where I do pay up for Ketel Marte, I can go to Victor Caratini in those lineups at 2,300 because Marte is pretty low owned. I can use Caratini for value there. I don't have to worry as much about the ownership. But just from a general roster construction standpoint, it becomes difficult to pay up for Marte a lot at second base because then I just keep having to find value elsewhere. And really, I'd like to be finding it at second base where I can. Moving over to third, Michael Dolan said, hasn't Corbin been pitching better the last 3 games? Actually, couldn't tell you. Not really something that I ever look at as far as like short, couple of game samples of pitching. If I know a pitcher is doing something different, or I think they're doing something different, I'll pay a little bit of attention just because, maybe they made some sort of adjustment. But overall, Corbin is probably just going to be the guy that he has been for the last 3 or 4 years. But to answer your question, yes, he has had four of his last 5 games. He's been good. 6 innings pitched in 4 of 5, 5 2/3 in the other. Gave up 2 earned runs in the 5 2/3 game. Gave up 7 in the 6 innings game. But yeah, like DraftKings scores of at least 22 DraftKings points in 4 of his last 5. Chances are still just kind of the same guy. Like I was saying, he's never been a horrible pitcher. He's just been a below average guy. It still sets up as an above average matchup for the Cubs. But, as good a time as any to remind you that like hitting a baseball is really, really hard. And that's why usually when you get really popular offenses, the approach is just going to be, I'll mix those guys in here and there, but I'll just find other offenses to go to because no matter who you're facing, if they're a major league pitcher, the odds are that they're going to be better than you, the hitter. So, it's kind of reinforces that Corbin's a below average pitcher, but he's still fully capable of putting together good starts. Devers, 2x the field on him. I like that a lot. Just a talent play. He's expensive, but only getting 10% ownership. Happy to get there. Getting to a bunch of wisdom at third base. He, like I said before, he's a really good value play, point per dollar, but also just has that power that gives you volatility, makes him a guy that I actually want to be getting to even at pretty high ownership. If I remember right, he actually can run a bit also. Pulling that up to double check, but if he can, like I said, a good matchup, good stolen base matchup against Corbin. He has 5 stolen bases this year in 67 games. He had 4 last year in 97. So he doesn't run a ton, but against Corbin, maybe. Eric Waugeman, batting 6, 2,800. Kind of the same thing as Jack Lopez, except he's hitting 6th at least. But not somebody I'd really want to be using as a one-off. But if you're stacking the Angels, throw him in for salary relief. He is, at least hitting 6th. Alec Boehm, same thing as I've said about all the other Phillies. Not a great matchup. Pretty good park. Good hitter. So that looks good. Suarez a little over the field. The field is getting to Wisdom a lot, which, like I said, I am. They're getting to Vientos a bit. I am lower than the field there. He's, a good enough hitter. Not a bad matchup against Taijuan Walker by any stretch. 265 expected ISO to right-handed hitters this year for Walker. 187 going back to last year. So there is plenty of home run upside here for Mark Vientos. But I'm getting to Devers more. I'm using Wisdom a lot at third base. So that's kind of costing me Vientos. Mauricio Dubon, another example from Houston, getting 12, 13% ownership. Third base and outfield eligible, only 2,500. Good point per dollar play. if Maurice Dubon puts up a game that I can't match somewhere else, then so be it. I'll move on to tomorrow. He's just another guy in that mix. Isaac Paredes, I'm not too far off the field there. Looks like I'm not really getting to the Cardinals too much. They are popular here against Luis Ortiz. It's just not a park that's very good for hitting home runs, and they are pretty popular. I think that they're good values. This team is pretty cheap offensively. Mentioned Donovan at 3,400, Arenado at 3,700. But if the ownership's going to be there, the range of outcomes for the Cardinals just really isn't different than a lot of other teams. And it's not a park that's conducive to hitting home runs, especially this time of year. Over the summer, it gets hot and humid in St. Louis. You'll see the ball carry better. Probably not going to be the case tonight. So I'm okay with just not getting as much of them as the field if that's the team the field's going to pick. Kind of like I was saying with the pitching, where if the field just sort of randomly picked one or two pitchers that out of that group that all look the same to be popular, I just wouldn't really play them. That's kind of, I think, what you're getting with the Cardinals. Like the Cubs getting ownership makes a lot of sense given the matchup and their salaries. Houston, given the matchup and their talent level, the Cubs, talent level too, makes a lot of sense. The Cardinals in that park, it's kind of like, yeah, the matchup's okay, but they're like marginally better than these other teams as opposed to being, I think, pretty clearly better. And the field's just like picking them as the third stack. So I'll just grab anybody else basically. I think that makes sense. At shortstop, a pretty weak shortstop slate today. No Gunnar Henderson, no Ellie De La Cruz. You do have CJ Abrams. You do have Swanson. Lindor is still out. So not a very good shortstop slate. Trey Turner you have, but that does make it a position where you could pay down a bit if you wanted to. But I am using Zach Neto a lot. And I do think this makes a lot of sense because the position is pretty weak. Neto is obviously one of the highest upside guys on the Angels. I already said I'm stacking the Angels, so obviously I'm going to get to Neto. But even if I weren't stacking the Angels, Neto is one of the guys that I think you go to if you have a non-Kikuchi lineup, but you don't want to just play an Angel stack. Zach Neto is still fine. You get a little bit of negative correlation. He's a talented enough guy as far as power upside, some stolen base upside. Negatively correlates with Kikuchi, and you're just not sacrificing a lot at shortstop. So I think he makes sense as a one-off or in stacks. Dansby Swanson looks good. 4,300, good matchup against Corbin. He'll steal on him. He'll hit home runs off of him. All of that looks good. Price tag's very reasonable. I'm a little below the field, but still clearly like getting to him. CJ Abrams, I love in tournaments here. 5,400, leading off, negatively correlates with Javier Assad. Gives you stolen base upside, gives you power upside. Field's not really playing him. So really, really like getting to CJ Abrams here. Assad has also been below average in the sample size that I have in my spreadsheet, at least, at preventing stolen bases. And that sets up really, really nicely for Abrams. I do also like that he's leading off because at least for his first at bat, it means if he gets on base, nobody's blocking him. So that's a very small positive. Also, Trey Turner, talent play again. 14% ownership for me, 6 for the field. Upside is certainly there, the way he can steal bases and hit for power. Taylor Walls is basically a punt. He doesn't really do a whole lot well other than play defense, and that doesn't get you fantasy points, but he will run a little bit, and most importantly, he's only $2,800. Caballero, 3,800 looks fine. Mason Wynn, stolen base upside, power upside. I think he's a good play. He's just one that I'm not really getting to, in part because I'm not getting to the Cardinals a lot overall. Acuna, I think homered yesterday, but not getting much ownership. He's batting ninth, 3,300. I don't mind it. I think if you were going to Met stacks, seeing that like Vientos is getting some ownership, this is a way that you can offset whatever ownership is there at least a little bit by paying down and getting some upside from your 9-hitter. The field is getting the Swanson a lot. They're getting the Pena, who I'm not getting to. This is one that scares me. Only having 2% Jeremy Pena. 4,100 is a good price tag. I like the matchup against Suarez. He is a chalk piece that, in not getting to him, I am actually concerned about. Similarly, I think I'd forgotten to look at third base, but okay, so I'm around the field on Bregman. I couldn't remember, but yeah, I'm concerned about not getting the Pena, but is what it is. I am at least happy with the way I'm playing shortstop. Like, I'm not getting away from Pena and then sacrificing upside. I'm getting away from Pena and playing other high upside guys that just are lower owned. Like Zach Neto at 1/5, 1/6 the ownership of Pena, I think is a perfectly fine pivot. Or obviously, if you're stacking the Angels, just a part of your stack. Swanson, I'm below the field, but I am getting to him. CJ Abrams, tons of upside, not getting a lot of ownership. Same goes for Turner. So I am kind of just paying up to be contrarian here, which wasn't what I expected to see, just knowing the layout of shortstop on this slate. I thought it would be another position where I saved money, but it looks like I'm kind of using it to pay up to be contrarian, where I'm saying, okay, the field's going to play Swanson, which is obviously fine. The field's going to play Mason Wynn. The field's going to play Jeremy Pena. I'm going to just play these guys that have legit stolen base and home run upside in Abrams and Turner, and hope that they have one of those games where they score 30 points and it doesn't matter if Jeremy Pena hit a home run. And hopefully it works out that way. And then finally in the outfield, Taylor Ward, Seiya Suzuki at the top. Ward not getting any ownership, leading off. Good one-off, I think. Good part of a stack, obviously. He's one of the few Angels hitters that I would want to play regardless. He has power upside. He's reasonably priced. Seiya Suzuki, 4,900, 17% ownership. A little over the field there. Good matchup, again, against Corbin. Good hitter. Gustavo Campero, I 100% honestly also do not know who he is. I'm assuming he also is not very good. He's batting 8th. He's minimum salary. He correlates with the guys that I'm playing. He saves me some money. He's 26. He switch hits. He is, I remember. Nope, never mind. I thought he was somebody that was on the Diamondbacks a couple years ago. He's 5'6". So, yeah, he's played 4 major league games. He projects for like a 130, mid 130s ISO, which, to recall, is also what Chalk Victor Caratini projects for. Projects to be a below average hitter, like a 90-ish WRC plus. So at 2,100, if you're stacking the Angels, fine. Certainly not somebody I'd want to be getting to outside of Angel stacks. I have him in 8 of 50 lineups right now. Of those 8 lineups, they are all Angel stacks. 3 of them are 5-mans. 1 of them's a 4-man. The others were 3-mans. So yeah, if you're not playing the Angels, you can ignore that guy. If you are playing the Angels, mix him in. Why not? Ian Happ, Jarren Duran, Kyle Tucker. Happy with all of those. Happ is right around the field. So again, it kind of looks like I'm not getting to the Cardinals at the same rate as the field. I'm not getting to the Astros at the same rate as the field. For the most part, I am getting to the Cubs mostly around the field, and that's the case with Happ. Jarren Duran, again, just paying up for talent. Not the best matchup, not the best park, but tons of stolen base upside, tons of power upside. Why not? Especially on a 6-game slate. Like, you're just getting there's a lot of talent available on this slate, considering there's only 6 games that the field just seems to not want to get to. I will gladly grab those guys. Kyle Tucker, lefty, getting 15% ownership, showing up 12% for me. He hits left-handed pitching really, really well. Suarez is good against lefties, but Suarez also probably not going very deep into this game. Dylan Carlson, leading off for Tampa at 2,600, a little bit over the field there. Again, field wants Caratini, field wants Dubon. I will take the leadoff hitter for Tampa instead and be perfectly happy with that. Corbin Carroll, really, really good. New arm around the field. That does look like a good value at 3,500. Jackson Chourio, I've been getting to the Brewers a lot, so not surprised to see that. A little below the field on Alvarez. Nothing really surprising there. Brandon Nimmo getting 15% ownership. I'm about half. Again, I think he's a good play. The Mets are another team kind of like the Cardinals, where I'm not going to, I think the Cardinals and Mets, along with the Diamondbacks probably, are very similar as far as like the third best offense goes today. The Mets are going to be a little bit more affordable than the Diamondbacks, as are the Cardinals. So that's why you're seeing more ownership go there. But it's just a situation where I don't think they're bad plays. If you wanted to play them instead of some of the other teams I'm playing, by all means. But they look very, very similar to other teams to me. And so I'm getting them some, just not as much as the field. Don't have Brendan Donovan in the outfield. So that looks like a pretty aggressive fade on Donovan for me right now. I wouldn't be upset if that changed, just because I do think he's a good value, especially at second base. But for whatever reason, his 14% ownership seems to just be grading out as a bit of a problem for me. Taylor is getting double-digit ownership. So is JD Martinez. I'm not really getting to those guys. So that seems to be pretty much how I'm approaching it. A big stand on the Angels, which I do think comes down at least a little bit, because I am going to make sure I project their ownership a little bit higher, just because, as I've said before, usually if I get this sort of like aggressive stand on the team facing the most popular pitcher, they just end up coming in double the ownership, because other people that play similarly to me do the same thing. So I do want to adjust for that, and I'll probably pull them back down a little bit. But Cubs, Milwaukee, Washington, Arizona, I think these teams all make sense. I'm even with the field on the Cubs. I'm over on these other 3 teams. I'm getting to Houston, just not as much as the field. You can see that the Mets and Cards are getting ownership, and teams that I'm just not really getting to. Which again, I think they're in good spots. They're perfectly fine. But as far as chalk offenses go, the Cubs and Astros are just bigger priorities for me. And that kind of pushes out these teams, and I push up the teams that are similar to them and just a little bit less likely to succeed. So that's how I'm approaching this one. I think it looks like a slate where there's a lot of different ways that you could approach it. Josh Roses wants a home run pick. The ones that immediately come to mind today are all really obvious. I mean, like, it's Astros against Suarez. It's Cubs against Corbin. Yeah, I don't have like a good Yastrzemski or Wallner one today, but I'll go Christian Walker against Tobias Myers. But yeah, that's on a little bit lower level of confidence than those two the other day. Can I recap favorite pitchers again? Yeah, so I none or all, depending how you want to view this. I'm very, very, very in line with the field on my pitching today. I think the field is handling pitching pretty much perfectly, whereas I think offensively they are getting a little too aggressive on the best spots. So Kikuchi's my highest owned guy. He's the field's highest owned guy. Bayo, Fad, Assad, Fetty, Severino, Littell, they're all just showing up like 16 to 24%. Bayo showing up a little bit higher. I'm pretty much in line with the field on pitching. I think these guys, I think Kikuchi's the clear number one pitcher, but he's also the most expensive. And then this group is just like all the same in terms of ownership, all the same in terms of projection, more or less. So for me, not really taking stands at pitcher. Michael said, is Corbin with Houston a bad idea or a good idea? It's perfectly fine. Like I was saying before when I was talking about my pitching at the top of the show, the more you're playing popular hitters, the more you should just be willing in those lineups to take stands on low and pitching. If I'm playing Patrick Corbin, playing him with Houston makes sense. So I can look. I have 4 Patrick Corbin lineups out of these 50. This is an Arizona, Milwaukee stack. Washington. Okay, so I actually don't really like how much he's. So like he correlates with Washington, which is fine from an ownership standpoint or chance of success standpoint. I don't love that aspect of it. So my point here isn't that I don't like those lineups, but I kind of thought that I would get Houston lineups with Corbin. Long story short, yeah, if you're playing Houston, Corbin's fine. Like he's probably not going to pitch well, but if you're playing Houston, obviously you're assuming they do well, and you're going to need them to beat the Cubs anyway, because no matter how well Houston does, if the Cubs outscore them, hit more home runs than them, your team's gonna lose to Cubs stacks. So you need them to beat the Cubs anyway. So using Corbin for some negative correlation makes sense in that lineup. Getting his low ownership makes sense in that lineup. So it's not like he is likely to succeed, but if you're going to like a full 5-man Houston stack where they're all 20% owned or whatever it is, then yeah, Corbin makes perfect sense in that lineup. How do I set my exposures exactly equal to the pool? I don't. That just is how it worked out. I ran through my entire lineup building process, figured out what 50 lineups I would have played if the slate started right now, and that's just how it was. Was not by design. A lot of Corbin with NPC players and expensive batters. Yeah. Good luck. So yeah, that's all I have for this one. Good luck on baseball tonight. Good luck on Showdown. I know Neil and I talked about that earlier. If you haven't watched that yet, that's available on this channel as well as his. He also has another show coming up an hour and a half before lock if you need to get caught up on that. But good luck on baseball. Good luck on football. I will be back here tomorrow at the same time. Thanks for checking out the show. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button on your way out the door, and good luck tonight.